Clara May Whitley's finger trembled on the trigger as she stared down at the wounded man, sprawled in the red dirt, his rifle just beyond his reach. Blood seeped from the bullet hole in his shoulder, staining his leather vest dark crimson, and his pale eyes burned with the kind of hatred that came from professional pride, wounded as deep as flesh. "Kill me or don't," he wheezed, spitting blood into the alkali dust. "But decide quick, girl. My partners are maybe 5 minutes behind me, and they ain't gonna be as patient as I was." Clara's hands shook as she kept the Winchester trained on Silas McCain, Horace Bellwether's best tracker, the man who'd hunted escaped slaves before the war, who'd tracked army deserters across 3 territories, who'd dragged more runaway girls back to Raven's Crossing than anyone else in Bellwether's employ. Well, Clara, just shoot him. Sadie's voice cracked with terror from behind the boulder, where she crouched, their mother's blue scarf clutched to her chest like armor. "He'll tell them which way we went." But Clara couldn't pull the trigger. Not on an unarmed, wounded man, no matter what he'd done. The weight of her Baptist upbringing, the echo of her mother's voice, teaching her the difference between justice and vengeance, held her finger frozen on the cold steel. "That's your problem, little preacher's daughter," McCain said with a bloody grin. "Too much conscience for the work at hand. Your daddy sure didn't raise you for the real world. Our daddy sold us to save his own skin." Clara replied, her voice steadier than her hands. "Don't pretend you know anything about what we were raised for." McCain's laugh turned into a coughing fit that sprayed more blood across the rocks. "Jed Whitley's been feeding Bellwether information for 3 years, girl. This ain't about debts or desperation. This is about a man who knows which side his bread's buttered on." The words hit Clara like physical blows. 3 years she and Sadie had been marked for sale since they were 16. "You're lying. Ask him yourself when we drag you back." McCain said, his breathing getting shallower. "Ask him about the families he's scouted, the girls he's identified, the reports he's filed on, which daughters would bring the best prices." Hoofbeats echoed from the canyon mouth, growing closer with each second. Clara's time was up. Kill McCain and buy them precious minutes, or let him live and honor what was left of her soul. She made her choice. "Sadie, run." Clara fired once into the ground beside McCain's head, close enough to spray him with rock chips and sand, then turned and sprinted for the narrow trail that led up through the red rocks. Behind her, McCain's voice rose in a howl that would guide his partners straight to them. There up the north face, cut them off at Devil's Backbone. The chase was on, 19 years old and running for her life through the New Mexico Badlands. Clara May Whitley reflected bitterly on how quickly everything could change. 6 months ago, she'd been teaching Sunday school and helping Sadie tend their small garden behind their father's church. Now she was a fugitive with a price on her head, hunted by men who saw her as nothing more than valuable livestock that had wandered off. The path up through the rocks was treacherous, barely wide enough for one person, and slick with morning dew that had frozen in the high-altitude air. Every step could send them tumbling into the canyon below. But the alternative was capture. And capture meant a return to Raven's Crossing Christian home. 3 months. That's how long she and Sadie had endured Miriam Bellwether's Christian education, learning to walk with their eyes downcast, to speak only when spoken to stand perfectly still while men examine them like horses at auction. The value of a Christian woman lies in her obedience. Miriam had said during their first orientation, her steel-gray hair pulled so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. Your thoughts, your desires, your very souls belong to God and to the men He has chosen to guide you. Clara had bitten her tongue bloody that first week, swallowing words that would have earned her a beating and made things worse for Sadie. Her sister had always been the gentle one, the dreamer who found beauty in prairie sunsets and poetry in the way wind moved through grass. Protecting that softness had been Clara's job since they were children, and she wasn't about to fail now. The compound had been a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. 20-foot adobe walls surrounded dormitories, workshops, and the main house where Horace Bellwether held court like a benevolent king. Clara had counted the guards, timed their rotations, mapped every entrance and exit during their carefully supervised walks to the chapel. Most importantly, she'd noticed Ruth, the aging black woman who worked in the kitchens, moved through the compound like a ghost, invisible to the guards and beneath the notice of the bellwethers. But Clara had caught her watching the girls with eyes that held depths of sorrow and hard-won wisdom. "You're planning something dangerous." Ruth had whispered one evening while helping Clara wash dishes, her words barely audible above the clatter of plates and cutlery. "I don't know what you mean." "Well, child, I've been in cages my whole life. I know the look of someone counting bars and timing guards." Clara had studied the old woman's face, searching for any sign of trap or betrayal. "Why do you care?" "Because I had a daughter once. Sweet girl, looked a lot like your sister. Bellwether got his hands on her 12 years ago." Ruth's voice had gone flat and empty. She lasted 4 months before she opened her wrists in the washroom. The pain in those words had convinced Clara more than any argument could have. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. But if you're serious about getting out, there's things you need to know." The escape had come during the weekly virtue display, a grotesque ceremony where potential buyers observed the girls performing domestic skills like sewing, cooking, and reciting scripture. Clara had been assigned to serve tea to a particularly repulsive cattle baron from El Paso when the opportunity presented itself. One carefully timed stumble, 1 cup of scalding tea in the right face, and chaos had erupted. In the confusion, she and Sadie had slipped away to the abandoned smokehouse, where Ruth had hidden supplies and shown them the entrance to the old mine tunnels that ran beneath the compound. "Follow the main shaft east for half a mile," Ruth had said, pressing a small bag of food and a loaded pistol into Clara's hands. "There's an exit by the creek bed, but don't stop there. Keep going until you reach the high country." "What about you?" "I'm 72 years old, child. My running days are done. But maybe I can buy you some time before they notice you're gone." That had been 18 hours ago. 18 hours of crawling through dark tunnels, stumbling across broken ground in starlight, and pushing themselves past the limits of exhaustion. Now they were being hunted by professionals, and their head start was evaporating with every mile. "Clara." Sadie's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "Someone's coming." Clara pressed herself against the rock wall and listened. Hoofbeats definitely, but from the wrong direction. These riders were coming from above, from the direction they were heading, which meant trap, she breathed. McCain had been more than just a tracker. He'd been bait drawing them up the mountain while his partners circled around to cut off their escape. But then she heard voices, and her heart nearly stopped. "Easy now. We ain't here to hurt anybody." The voice was deep calm, carrying the kind of authority that came from hard experience rather than empty bluster. Clara peered around the boulder and saw 2 riders picking their way carefully down the trail, dark-skinned men with shoulder-length black hair and clothes that had seen hard use. The older one bore scars across his left cheek that spoke of violence survived, while the younger moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd grown up in the saddle. Both had their weapons visible, but not drawn, a sign of caution rather than aggression. "Miss Whitley," the scarred man called out. "Clara May Whitley. My name's Toma Gray Elk, and this is my brother Caleb. We've come to help." Clara kept her rifle trained on them, finger ready on the trigger. "Help? How help? Drag us back to that hell for the bounty money." "Help you disappear," Toma replied, his dark eyes meeting hers across the narrow trail. "Help you get somewhere Bellwether's reach can't find you." "But why?" The question came from Sadie, who'd emerged from cover despite Clara's warning gesture. Caleb Gray Elk answered, his young voice carrying an edge of bitter experience. "Because some cages need to be broken, and some people are worth the risk of breaking them." Below them, new shouts echoed up from the canyon floor. McCain's partners had found their tracker and were organizing a proper search. They had maybe 10 minutes before the net closed completely. "Your choice," Toma said, his scarred face grave. Come with us, or try to make it on your own, but decide fast. Clara looked at her sister, seeing her own desperate hope reflected in those gentle eyes. It could be another trap, another lie designed to make them lower their guard. But the alternative was certain capture. And sometimes the only choice was between different kinds of risk. "All right," she said, shouldering her rifle. "But we're partners, not property." Toma Gray Elk's smile was sharp as a blade. Wouldn't have it any other way. The Gray Elk brothers led them down a hidden trail that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. Their horses picking their way between boulders and gaps that could break a leg or snap a neck. Behind them, McCain's voice echoed off the canyon walls as he directed the search, his professional pride apparently overriding the pain from his wounded shoulder. "North face, you idiots." They went up the north face. Clara rode behind Toma on his paint stallion, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, with the unfamiliar rhythm of horseback travel making her stomach lurch with every step. The man's back was hard with muscle and old scars, and she could feel the tension in his shoulders as he listened to the sounds of pursuit. "How far to safety?" she asked, her voice barely carrying over the clatter of hooves on stone. "Define safety," Toma replied without turning around. "There's a place I know in the high country, good water and plenty of cover. But Bellwether's got influence all through these territories. Nowhere's really safe until we deal with the source." "Deal with it how?" "By giving the territorial marshal something he can't ignore." The trail opened onto a broader ledge, and Clara caught her first clear view of their pursuers. 7 riders now spread out across the canyon floor in a professional search pattern. McCain sat his horse with one arm in a makeshift sling, but his pale eyes were sharp with focus as he tracked their route up the mountainside. "Persistent bastard," Caleb observed, following her gaze. "I put a bullet in his shoulder, and he's still giving orders like nothing happened. That's what makes him good at his job," Toma said grimly. McCain's tracked escaped slaves through 3 states, hunted army deserters across half the territory. He don't give up easy. "Then we make sure he don't have a choice," Clara said, checking the pistol Ruth had given her. 6 shots plus whatever was in Toma's rifle. Not much against 7 professional killers, but it would have to do. The ledge narrowed again, forcing them into single file as they followed what looked like an old deer path along the cliff face. To their left, the rock wall rose nearly vertical, offering no handholds for climbing. To their right, a drop of 300 feet ended in sharp rocks and certain death. "There," Toma said, pointing to a gap in the rock wall ahead. "Hidden canyon, good defensive position. We can hold them off long enough to figure out our next move." But as they approached the gap, Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks in the soft sand, too recent to be anything but a trap. "Toma, wait!" The rifle shot cracked like thunder, and Caleb's horse screamed as the bullet took it in the chest. The animal went down hard, pinning the young man's leg beneath its weight as it thrashed in its death agonies. "Caleb!" Sadie scrambled from her perch behind him, somehow managing to avoid the flailing hooves as she tried to pull him free. More shots echoed from the hidden canyon muzzle flashes, revealing at least 3 shooters positioned among the rocks. They'd been expected, their route predicted and prepared for. "Ambush," Toma snarled, wheeling his horse around as bullets whined past their heads. "McCain herded us right into it." Clara slid from the horse and ran to help Sadie with Caleb, both girls straining to lift the dead animal enough for him to pull his leg free. Blood seeped through his pants where the bone had snapped, and his face was white with shock and pain. "Can you ride?" Clara asked. "Do I have a choice?" Caleb replied through gritted teeth. Toma's rifle spoke with deadly precision, and one of the shooters in the canyon stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. But return fire was already forcing them to take cover behind scattered boulders, and Clara could hear more riders coming up the trail behind them. They were trapped between two forces, caught in a kill zone with nowhere to run and no way to fight back effectively. "This ain't working," Clara said, reloading her pistol with mechanical precision. "We need to change the game." "How?" Toma asked, snapping off another shot at the canyon ambushers. Clara looked around at their desperate situation, wounded companion, limited ammunition enemies, front and back. Then she looked at the cliff face beside them, noting the way the rock had been fractured by weather and wind into a series of narrow ledges and crevices. "Sadie," she said, "remember when we used to climb the church bell tower?" Her sister's eyes widened with understanding. "Clara, that's suicide. Maybe. But it's better than sitting here waiting to get shot." Clara checked her pistol one more time, then thrust it into her belt. "Can you make it?" "I can make it. But what about Caleb? I'm not going anywhere," the young man said firmly, accepting Toma's rifle as his brother prepared for his own climb. "Someone needs to keep them busy down here." Clara nodded, understanding the sacrifice he was making. With his broken leg, Caleb would never make the climb, but he could buy them time with covering fire. "Give us 10 minutes, she said. "Then follow us up if you can." The climb was a nightmare of loose rock and desperate handholds, every movement calculated to avoid making noise that would give away their position. Clara led the way, finding holds by feel more than sight, her hands already scraped bloody by the sharp stone. Behind her, Sadie climbed with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent her childhood in apple trees and barn lofts, while Toma brought up the rear with his rifle slung across his back. They were halfway up the cliff face when the shooting started in earnest below them. Caleb's rifle cracked rhythmically as he traded shots with the ambushers, while return fire sent rock chips flying around their position. "Faster," Toma urged. "They'll spot us soon." Clara's lungs burned with the thin air and desperate exertion, but she forced herself to keep climbing. Above them, the cliff face was broken by what looked like a narrow ledge barely wide enough for one person, but offering the first real cover they'd found. She made it with her strength, nearly exhausted, hauling herself over the edge on her belly before turning to help Sadie up. Toma followed moments later, his scarred face grim with determination. "And now what?" Sadie asked, pressing herself against the rock wall as bullets continued to fly below them. Clara peered over the edge, studying the tactical situation with new eyes. The ambushers in the canyon were focused on Caleb's position, while McCain's riders were still working their way up the trail. From their current position, she and her companions had a clear field of fire on both groups. "Now we turn hunters into hunted," she said, unslingering her rifle. From their perch on the narrow ledge, Clara had a perfect view of the tactical disaster unfolding below. Caleb was pinned behind a boulder, with his wounded leg stretched out awkwardly, his rifle ammunition running low as he tried to keep 7 men at bay. Blood had soaked through his pants leg, and she could see him growing weaker with each passing minute. 3 in the canyon, 4 coming up the trail, Toma muttered, sighting down his rifle barrel. 10 rounds between us, maybe 12 if Sadie's got any left in that pistol. 8. Sadie replied, checking her weapon with the methodical care their father had taught them both. Papa might have been a drunk, but he was thorough about some things. Clara felt the familiar twist of pain and anger at the mention of their father. Jed Whitley, who'd supposedly sold them to pay debts, but according to McCain, had been scouting for Bellwether for years. The man who'd taught them to shoot and read scripture, who'd also marked them for slavery before they were old enough to understand what that meant. Focus, she told herself, settling into firing position. Deal with the past later. Survive the present first. Below them, McCain had reached Caleb's position and was shouting orders to his men. The tracker's arm hung useless in its sling, but his voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Flank him. 2 of you, circle left. 2 more, go right. Pin him down so he can't cover the cliff face." Clara realized with cold certainty that they'd figured out the climb. In maybe 2 minutes, McCain's men would be scanning the rock wall, and their hiding place would be exposed. "We need to move," she said. "This ledge is about to become a death trap." "Near where?" Toma asked. "It's 100 feet to the next cover and all of it exposed." Clara studied the cliff face above them, noting the way the rock had been carved by wind and water into a series of natural chimneys and crevices. Dangerous to climb, nearly impossible in their current situation. But maybe their only chance. "Up," she said simply. "We go up until we find a position they can't reach." But before they could move, a new voice cut through the gunfire, below Young, frightened but determined. "Don't shoot, I'm coming out." Clara's heart nearly stopped as she recognized the voice. Eleanor Hartwell, one of the girls from the compound, was stumbling out of the hidden canyon with her hands raised and her dress torn from running through the desert. "Eleanor," Sadie whispered, "but how did she—" "Trap," Toma said grimly. "Bellwether sent her to flush us out." But Clara wasn't so sure. Something in the girl's posture, the way she kept glancing back toward the canyon mouth, suggested desperation rather than deception. "Please," Eleanor called out, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "I know you're up there. I saw you climb. I need help." One of McCain's riders had his rifle trained on the girl, finger tightening on the trigger. Clara realized with sick certainty that Eleanor was about to die, whether she was bait or genuine escapee. The decision came without conscious thought. Clara's rifle spoke, and the rider toppled from his horse with a bullet through his chest. "Eleanor, run!" she shouted. "Get to cover." The canyon erupted into chaos as all pretense of stealth disappeared. McCain's remaining men scattered for cover, while return fire chewed chunks from the ledge around Clara's position. Below them, Caleb renewed his desperate defense, his rifle cracking steadily as he tried to keep the enemy pinned down. Eleanor ran with the desperate speed of someone who'd already seen too much death, diving behind a cluster of boulders just as bullets began to pepper the ground around her feet. "Clara," the girl shouted up at the ledge. "There's something you need to know about your father." "Not now," Clara replied, working the bolt action and searching for another target. "He's here." Eleanor's voice carried clearly despite the gunfire. "Jed Whitley's here, McCain. Brought him to identify your bodies." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Their father was here somewhere, in this maze of rocks and bullets, brought along to confirm that his daughters were truly dead. "Where?" she called back. "The canyon mouth. They've got him tied to a horse." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. If their father was here, if he was close enough to see what happened next, then this wasn't just about escape anymore. This was about confrontation, about facing the man who'd sold them, and demanding answers to questions that had been burning in her chest for months. "Sadie," she said, turning to her sister. "Can you get to Eleanor, help her find better cover?" "What about you?" "I'm going after Papa." Toma grabbed her arm before she could move. "That's suicide. McCain's got at least 3 men between here and the canyon mouth, and they're all professional killers. Then help me kill them." Clara replied, her voice cold as winter wind. "Because I'm going with or without you." Toma studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "All right. But we do this smart, not stupid." Caleb, his brother, looked up from his position below blood loss, making his face pale, but his eyes still alert. "Can you hold here for 10 more minutes?" "Make it 15, Caleb called back. "I've got ideas about evening the odds." What followed was the most dangerous 10 minutes of Clara's life. She and Toma worked their way along the cliff face, using a combination of climbing and sheer desperation, trading shots with McCain's men, while trying to avoid the bullets that whined constantly around their position. Twice they were nearly cut off by flanking maneuvers, and once Clara had to shoot a man at point-blank range when he tried to rush their position with a knife. The blood and violence should have sickened her, but all she felt was a cold determination to reach the canyon mouth and face the man who'd betrayed them. They made it to the last ridge before the canyon opened up, and Clara got her first clear view of the scene below. McCain sat his horse in the center of a natural amphitheater, his wounded arm hanging useless, but his pale eyes sharp with focus. Around him, his surviving men had taken defensive positions among the rocks, and tied to a horse at the edge of the group, his hands bound and his face bloody from rough treatment, was Jed Whitley. Their father looked older than Clara remembered, his hair gone white, and his shoulders bent with shame and defeat. But his eyes were clear, and when they met hers across the rocky expanse, she saw something there that might have been love. "Clara," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Clara, honey, I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." McCain's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "Save your breath, preacher. Your daughters are about to join you in hell." The reunion Clara had imagined in her darkest moments was nothing like the reality of seeing her father bound and bloodied in the desert sun. Jed Whitley looked broken in ways that went deeper than physical abuse, his eyes holding depths of shame and self-loathing that made her chest ache with unwanted sympathy. "Papa." She called down from her position on the ridge, her rifle trained on McCain, but her attention fixed on the man who'd raised her. "Is it true? Have you been working for Bellwether all this time?" Jed's head dropped as if the words were a physical weight. 3 years, he said, his voice barely carrying across the rocks. 3 years of scouting families, identifying girls, filing reports on which daughters would bring the best prices. The confirmation hit harder than Clara had expected. She'd known intellectually that McCain wasn't lying. But hearing it from her father's own lips, seeing the shame in his eyes, made the betrayal real in a way that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Why?" Sadie's voice came from somewhere behind Clara, small and broken. "Money at first." Jed replied, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "After your mother died, I couldn't think straight. The bottle helped, but bottles cost money, and I had debts." "So you sold other people's daughters?" Clara said, her voice flat with disgust. "I told myself it was placement work. Domestic service, maybe marriages to good families. Bellwether showed me papers, references, talked about Christian charity and helping girls escape poverty." McCain's laugh cut through the confession like a blade. "You believed what you wanted to believe, preacher. Made it easier to cash the checks. When did you know?" Clara asked. "When did you understand what you were really doing?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, his shoulders shaking with either grief or guilt. "The night Eleanor tried to run. Bellwether brought her back himself, made me watch while he taught her the price of disobedience." Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. Eleanor had tried to escape before, and their father had witnessed her punishment. Had done nothing to help, nothing to intervene. "That was 8 months ago," she said. 8 months you knew the truth, and you still handed us over." "I tried to stop," Jed said desperately. "I went to Bellwether, told him I was done, that he could find another scout. But he had records evidence of my participation. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd have me arrested for conspiracy and kidnapping. So you chose yourself over us. I chose to stay alive long enough to find a way to get you out." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Clara felt herself torn between fury and desperate hope. Was it possible? Had their father really been trying to help them? Or was this just another lie told by a broken man to ease his conscience? "How?" she asked. "How were you planning to get us out?" "The Gray Elk brothers." Jed set his eyes, finding Toma's position on the ridge. "I knew their reputation, knew they'd helped other girls escape. I begged them to watch for you, to be ready when the time came." Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. If that was true, if their father had really arranged their rescue, then everything she'd believed about their situation was wrong. But before she could process the implications, McCain's voice cut through her thoughts like a whip crack. "Enough talking. You girls got 2 choices. Come down peaceful, or we start putting bullets in your daddy until you do." To emphasize his point, one of McCain's men put his pistol to Jed's temple and cocked the hammer. "You got 10 seconds," McCain shouted. After that, the preacher starts dying slow. Clara felt the familiar weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. Surrender meant a return to Raven's Crossing, meant slavery and degradation and eventual death. But fighting meant watching her father die regardless of his crimes and betrayals. "Clara," Toma said quietly. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. He made his choices. Now you make yours." But Clara was already moving, already sliding down the rocky slope toward the canyon floor with her rifle held low but ready. Behind her, she could hear Sadie calling her name, could hear Toma cursing under his breath. Some debts she thought could only be paid in person. She made it halfway to the canyon floor before the hidden guns opened up. The ambush was perfect, professionally planned, and flawlessly executed. What Clara had taken for natural rock formations were actually concealed firing positions, and what she'd assumed was empty ground was actually a carefully constructed kill zone. McCain's men emerged from cover, like deadly flowers blooming in the desert, their rifles already trained on her position. She dove left as the first volley split the air where she'd been standing, rolling behind a boulder, as return fire chewed chunks from the stone. "Stupid girl," McCain shouted, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Did you really think I'd give you an honest chance?" Clara checked her rifle, counting cartridges by touch. 4 rounds left, plus whatever ammunition Toma might have. Not enough for a sustained firefight, not against professional killers with superior positions and unlimited time. But then Eleanor's voice cut through the gunfire, sharp with desperation, and something that might have been hope. "Clara, the canyon wall. There's a way out." Clara risked a glance in the girl's direction and saw her pointing toward what looked like a solid rock face. But as she looked closer, she could see a narrow crack in the stone, barely wide enough for one person, hidden by shadows and optical illusion. "It leads to the old mine complex," Eleanor shouted. "The tunnels run for miles." Understanding hit Clara like lightning. The same mine system they'd used to escape from Raven's Crossing extended this far into the mountains. If they could reach that crack, if they could get into the tunnels before McCain's men cut them off. "Sadie," she called up to the ridge. "Can you make it down here?" "Already on my way." Clara turned to see her sister picking her way down the slope with desperate speed, using handholds and ledges that Clara hadn't even noticed. Behind her came Toma, his rifle speaking steadily as he provided covering fire. But McCain wasn't finished. As Clara watched in horror, the tracker pulled out a long-bladed knife and pressed it to Jed's throat. "Stop right there," he shouted. "One more step and your daddy's blood paints these rocks." Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the blade bite into her father's neck. A thin line of blood appeared bright red against his weathered skin. "That's better," McCain said with satisfaction. "Now you're going to put down that rifle and walk over here nice and slow. Your sister, too. Any tricks, any sudden movements, and the preacher dies screaming." Clara looked around at the tactical situation, seeing no good options. McCain had them dead to rights, and her father's life hung by the thickness of a knife blade. But then Jed Whitley did something that changed everything. With a roar of rage and desperation, he threw himself backward off his horse, the sudden movement catching McCain off guard and sending the knife skittering across the rocks. The impact drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping in the dust, but it also created the distraction Clara needed. Her rifle spoke 3 times in rapid succession, the bullets taking McCain's nearest men's center mass and dropping them where they stood. Beside her, Toma's weapon cracked with deadly precision, and suddenly the odds were shifting in their favor. "The crack," Eleanor shouted, already running toward the hidden entrance. Everyone to the crack. What followed was chaos, desperate running bullets whining overhead and the sound of men shouting and horses screaming as the canyon turned into a war zone. Clara reached her father first, cutting his bonds with hands that shook with adrenaline and relief. "Can you run?" she asked. "Do I have a choice?" Jed replied, struggling to his feet on legs, weakened by hours of captivity. Together, the small group fought their way toward the crack in the canyon wall, using covering fire and sheer desperation to keep McCain's surviving men at bay. Behind them, Caleb's rifle continued to speak from his position on the ledge, his wounded leg apparently not preventing him from making every shot count. They reached the crack just as McCain himself appeared, his wounded arm forgotten. In his rage, a pistol clutched in his good hand. "You think you've won?" he snarled, raising the weapon toward Clara's back. "You think this is over?" The shot echoed off the canyon walls, flat and final. But it wasn't McCain who fired. Eleanor stood behind him with a smoking pistol in her hands, her young face transformed by an expression of absolute determination. "It's over," she said quietly. "It's finally over." McCain looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, his pale eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He tried to raise his pistol one more time, but his strength was leaving him with his blood. "How?" he whispered. "Ruth taught me." Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "She taught all of us. Said someday we might need to know how to kill the monsters." Silas McCain, Bellwether's best tracker and most feared enforcer, fell face first into the red dirt of the canyon floor and moved no more. The crack in the canyon wall led to a narrow passage that opened into a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness and its walls carved smooth by centuries of flowing water. Emergency lanterns left by previous travelers cast dancing shadows on the stone, and the air carried the scent of minerals and deep places. "Oh, Jesus," Caleb breathed, leaning heavily on Toma's shoulder as they helped him through the passage. "How far do these tunnels go?" "All the way to Mexico if you follow the right paths." Eleanor replied, her voice echoing strangely in the large space. "The old miners followed every vein of silver, and the silver went deep." Clara looked around at the chamber, noting the multiple passages that branched off in different directions. This wasn't just an escape route. It was an entire underground highway, a network that could hide an army if necessary. "How do you know so much about this place?" she asked Eleanor. The girl's face went pale in the lantern light. "Because I've been here before. This is where Bellwether brings the girls who fight back too hard, who cause too much trouble. He calls it deep meditation. But really, it's just another kind of torture." Clara felt her stomach turn. "How long?" 2 weeks last time. Alone in the dark with just enough food and water to keep from dying. He said it would teach me humility, help me understand my proper place in God's plan. "That's when you tried to escape before?" Sadie said, understanding dawning in her voice. Eleanor nodded, tears glistening in the lamplight. "But I never made it out. They caught me at the canyon mouth, dragged me back for discipline." Her voice broke on the last word. "That's when your father saw what really happened to girls who disobeyed." Clara felt the pieces clicking together in her mind, forming a picture that was both better and worse than she'd imagined. "Papa witnessed your punishment. He tried to stop it," Eleanor said quietly. Begged Bellwether to show mercy, said beating a child wasn't Christian behavior. That's when Bellwether told him the truth about what the compound really was. Jed's voice came from the shadows, thick with shame and self-loathing. "I'd been blind for 3 years, telling myself I was helping families find opportunities for their daughters. When I saw what they did to Eleanor, when I understood what I'd really been part of, you could have run." Clara said, her anger warring with unwanted sympathy. "You could have taken us and disappeared." "Where?" Jed asked desperately. "Bellwether owns half the territory. Judges, sheriffs, federal marshals, they're all in his pocket or scared of his influence. Running would have just made us fugitives with nowhere to hide. So instead you handed us over." "I bought time," Jed corrected. "Convinced him to let me deliver you personally, let me be there for the transition. Said it would be easier on everyone if you heard it from your father." Clara stared at him, trying to understand. You were planning something. I contacted the Gray Elk brothers 6 months ago, Jed admitted. Told them about Bellwether's operation, about what was going to happen to you girls. Asked them to be ready when the time came. Toma stepped forward, his scarred face grave in the lamplight. He offered us everything he had, his church, his land, his life savings, if we'd help you escape and bring Bellwether down. But you didn't need money. Sadie said, understanding, beginning to dawn. No, Caleb replied grimly. We needed something else. We needed inside information about the compound's security guard rotations tunnel systems. Things only someone who'd been working with Bellwether for years would know. The full scope of the deception hit Clara like a physical blow. Papa wasn't just Bellwether's scout. He was our inside man. For 6 months, Eleanor confirmed. Ever since he saw what happened to me, he's been feeding information to the resistance. Names of girls being held, locations of safe houses, guard schedules, everything we needed to start fighting back. Clara felt her worldview shifting again, the simple narrative of betrayal and abandonment becoming something far more complex. Her father was still guilty of 3 years of complicity, still responsible for countless destroyed lives. But he'd also spent the last 6 months trying to make amends, risking everything to save not just his daughters, but every girl trapped in Bellwether's system. There's more, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. The virtue display yesterday, when you escaped, that wasn't an accident. Your father drugged the guard's coffee, created the distraction that let you get away, and paid for it with a beating that nearly killed him, Toma added. Bellwether suspected sabotage, but couldn't prove it. Clara looked at her father, seeing the bruises and cuts that marked his face and hands, understanding now why he'd looked so broken when McCain's men brought him to the canyon. Why didn't you tell us? Because you needed to hate me, Jed replied, his voice thick with emotion. You needed to be angry enough to fight, strong enough to survive. If you'd known I was trying to help you, might have hesitated, might have tried to save me instead of yourselves. We still would have tried to save you, Sadie said softly. I know. That's why I couldn't tell you. The chamber fell silent, except for the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Clara tried to process everything she'd learned, tried to reconcile the man who'd sold children with a man who'd risked everything to stop it. But before she could speak, Eleanor grabbed her arm with desperate urgency. We need to move, she said. McCain was supposed to report in an hour ago. When he doesn't, Bellwether will send more men. How many more? Toma asked. All of them, Eleanor replied grimly. Every guard, every tracker, every killer on his payroll. He can't afford to let us escape, not with what we know. Clara felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders at the knowledge that whatever decision she made next would determine the fate of everyone in this chamber. They could run deeper into the tunnels, try to reach Mexico and start new lives as fugitives. Or they could fight, use their inside knowledge to strike back at the system that had tried to destroy them. Where's the compound from here? She asked Eleanor. 2 miles through the tunnels, maybe less. There's an entrance in the old mine shaft behind the chapel. And Bellwether, still there as far as I know. He never leaves during a hunt, likes to be available when the girls are brought back for punishment. Clara looked around at her companions, her wounded sister, the Gray Elk brothers with their guns, and hard experience Eleanor with her knowledge of the compound's secrets, and her father with his guilt and desperate need for redemption. We're going back, she said finally. Clara. Sadie started to protest. We're going back. Clara repeated, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. Not to surrender, not to hide. We're going back to end this. The tunnel that led back to Raven's Crossing was a nightmare of narrow passages and vertical climbs that tested every member of their small group. Caleb's broken leg made him a liability, forcing Toma to help him navigate obstacles that would have been challenging for a healthy person. Eleanor led the way with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey before. But Clara could see the strain in her young face as memories of her captivity pressed close in the darkness. "There," Eleanor whispered, pointing to a faint glow ahead. "That's the chapel entrance." Clara crept forward and peered through the crack in the rock wall. They were looking into the compound cemetery, where weathered wooden crosses marked the graves of girls who died in Bellwether's care. The chapel itself loomed against the starlit sky, its white walls gleaming with deceptive purity. "The guards?" Toma asked softly. "2 at the main gate, 2 more walking the perimeter," Clara reported. "But they're not expecting trouble from this direction." "They will be soon," Eleanor said grimly. "When McCain doesn't report in Bellwether, we'll lock down everything. Triple the guards, seal all the exits, turn this place into a fortress." Clara studied the compound's layout, noting the positions of buildings and the likely location of guards. The dormitories were dark, which meant the girls were either asleep or had been moved to more secure locations. The main house showed lights in several windows, including what she recognized as Bellwether's office on the 2nd floor. "How many girls are still inside?" she asked. 16, maybe 18. Some of the newer ones are too scared to run, and others are too broken to believe freedom is possible. "We get them all out," Clara said firmly. "Every last one." "That's not possible," Toma protested. "We're 5 people against a compound full of guards. The smart play is to hit Bellwether's office, grab whatever evidence we can find, and disappear before reinforcements arrive." "The smart play got us into this mess," Clara replied. "The smart play is why girls like Eleanor spend weeks alone in underground chambers, why families get destroyed for profit, why men like Bellwether think they own other human beings." She turned to face the group, her young face hard with determination. "We're not running anymore. We're not hiding. We're going to burn this place to the ground and make sure everyone knows why. And if we die in the attempt," Caleb asked, "then we die fighting instead of living as slaves." Eleanor reached out and touched Clara's arm. "There might be another way. Something that could get the girls out without a direct assault. Tell me." "The weekly virtue display is tomorrow night. All the girls will be in the main hall performing for potential buyers. If we could create a distraction during the ceremony, they'd all be in one place." Sadie finished understanding the opportunity. "With minimal guard coverage." "Ah." Toma added his tactical mind, already working through the possibilities. "Most of Bellwether's men would be positioned around the perimeter." Clara felt hope rising in her chest. "How do we get inside?" Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. "The same way I got out to warn you about McCain. There's a service entrance behind the kitchen that's only guarded during meal preparation. Ruth has the key." Ruth's still alive, as of yesterday. "Bellwether suspects she helped with your escape, but he can't prove it. He's keeping her under watch, but not in chains." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. Eleanor would return to the compound alone, claiming to have escaped during the confusion in the canyon. While Bellwether's attention was focused on questioning her, the others would infiltrate through the service entrance and position themselves around the main hall. When the virtue display began, they would create multiple distractions, fires, explosions, anything to cause panic and confusion. In the chaos, the girls would be evacuated through the kitchen entrance, while Clara and Toma confronted Bellwether directly. "What about evidence?" Jed asked. "Without proof of his crimes, he'll just rebuild somewhere else." "I'll get the evidence," Eleanor said quietly. "While everyone's dealing with the chaos, I'll make my way to his office and take everything. Account books, correspondence, bills of sale, all of it." "That's suicide," Caleb protested. "If you're caught." "If I'm caught, I'm dead anyway," Eleanor replied with matter-of-fact acceptance. "But if I succeed, this ends. Really ends." They spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for what might be their final battle. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, escape routes, memorized contingency plans, discussed and refined. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Eleanor prepared to return to her captivity. "If this goes wrong," she said to Clara, "if I don't make it out." "You'll make it out," Clara replied firmly. "We all will. But if I don't, promise me something. Promise me you'll tell people what really happened here. Make sure the world knows that we fought back." Clara gripped the girl's hands, feeling the calluses and scars that marked a life of forced labor. "I promise. But you're going to tell them yourself." Eleanor nodded, straightening her torn dress and arranging her hair to hide the worst of her injuries. "See you tonight." She slipped away into the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the careful stealth of someone who'd learned to be invisible. Clara watched until she disappeared around the chapel wall, then turned to face the long day of waiting ahead. By evening, the compound was buzzing with activity, as preparations for the virtue display reached their climax. Clara and her companions crept through the shadows around the perimeter, noting the increased guard presence and the nervous energy that seemed to permeate the air. "Something's wrong," Toma murmured. "Too many guards, too much tension. They're expecting trouble." "Maybe Eleanor was caught," Sadie suggested, her voice tight with worry. "No," Clara said, studying the patterns of movement around the main building. "If she'd been caught, they'd be conducting searches, not preparing for a ceremony. Something else is happening." Her question was answered when Horace Bellwether himself emerged from the main house, resplendent in his finest suit and wearing the expression of a man who just won a significant victory. Behind him came Miriam, her steel-gray hair gleaming in the lamplight, her thin lips curved in a satisfied smile. And between them, her hands bound, and her dress torn from rough handling, was Eleanor. "Trap," Caleb breathed. "It's a trap." Clara felt her heart sink as she realized the truth. Eleanor hadn't been caught, she'd been expected. Somehow Bellwether had known she was coming, had been waiting for her return. "We abort," Toma said firmly. "Fall back to the tunnels and regroup." But Clara was already moving toward the compound walls, her rifle ready and her mind made up. "No. We go in now while they think they've won. We save Eleanor and everyone else, or we die trying." "Clara, wait." But she was already gone. Slipping through a gap in the adobe wall that Eleanor had shown them during their planning session. Behind her, she could hear the others following their footsteps, silent as death in the desert night. The final battle for Raven's Crossing was about to begin. The main hall blazed with lamplight as Clara crept through the shadows of the kitchen complex, her heart hammering against her ribs with each careful step. Through the tall windows, she could see the obscene spectacle of the virtue display, in full swing, 18 girls standing in perfect lines, while potential buyers examined them like livestock at auction. Eleanor stood at the center of the group, her wrists bound, but her head held high with defiant pride. Even from a distance, Clara could see the fresh bruises on her face, evidence of the questioning she'd endured since her capture that morning. "Remember," Toma whispered from beside her, "we stick to the plan. Create chaos, evacuate the girls, get out alive." But Clara's attention was fixed on the raised platform where Horace Bellwether held court, his silver hair gleaming as he gestured expansively to the assembled buyers. Among them, she recognized faces from wanted posters, cattle barons with blood on their hands, mine owners who treated workers like disposable equipment, politicians whose corruption was exceeded only by their cruelty. "Gentlemen," Bellwether's cultured voice carried clearly through the open windows. "Tonight, we have a special presentation. Not just our usual selection of properly trained young ladies, but a demonstration of what happens to those who choose rebellion over obedience." He gestured toward Eleanor, who stood motionless despite the rope around her wrists. "This young woman attempted to escape our care, not once, but twice. She has corrupted other residents with ideas of independence and self-determination that are frankly incompatible with Christian womanhood. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd of buyers, their faces showing the kind of anticipation that made Clara's stomach turn. Whatever Bellwether had planned for Eleanor, it was designed to be both punishment and entertainment. However, Bellwether continued, his voice taking on the honeyed tone of a preacher delivering salvation. I believe in redemption. I believe that even the most wayward soul can be brought back to the path of righteousness through proper guidance. He nodded to Miriam, who stepped forward, carrying a leather case that Clara recognized with cold dread. She'd seen similar cases in her father's church, used for storing the instruments of communion. But the tools, Miriam revealed, had nothing to do with salvation. No! Sadie breathed from Clara's other side, her young face pale with horror. Clara didn't hesitate. Her rifle spoke through the open window, the bullet taking one of Bellwether's guards center mass and sending him tumbling from the platform. The crack of gunfire shattered the genteel atmosphere like breaking glass, transforming the orderly ceremony into screaming chaos. Now! Clara shouted, vaulting through the window with Toma and Sadie close behind. The main hall erupted into pandemonium as buyers dove for cover and guards scrambled for their weapons. Clara fought her way toward the platform where Eleanor stood, her rifle speaking with deadly precision as she cleared a path through the confusion. But Bellwether was ready for them. Instead of fleeing or seeking cover, he grabbed Eleanor by the throat and pressed a knife to her neck, his cultured mask finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. Stop right there. He roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. One more step and this little rebel dies screaming. Clara froze her rifle, trained on Bellwether's chest, but unable to fire without risking Eleanor's life. Around the hall, the other girls huddled together in terrified groups, while guards took defensive positions among the overturned tables and chairs. That's better. Bellwether said, his breathing heavy, but his voice regaining its usual calm authority. Now, Miss Whitley, you're going to put down that rifle and surrender yourself to proper justice. Let her go. Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. This is between you and me. Oh, but it's not. Bellwether replied, pressing the knife deeper until a thin line of blood appeared on Eleanor's neck. This is about order, Miss Whitley. About maintaining the natural hierarchy that God himself established. God doesn't enslave children. God gives dominion to those wise enough to exercise it properly. Bellwether's pale eyes gleamed with fanatical certainty. These girls are better off under my guidance than they would be in the world. I provide them with purpose, with structure, with the knowledge of their proper place in creation. You provide them with rape and torture and death. I provide them with what they need. Bellwether corrected. Some require gentleness, others need firmer guidance. But all of them benefit from learning that their value lies in service, not in the selfish pursuit of personal desires. Clara felt rage building in her chest like wildfire, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting angry would only put Eleanor in more danger. What do you want? She asked. Simple. You and your sister surrender yourselves for proper re-education. In exchange, I'll allow the other girls to live. And Eleanor, Bellwether's smile was sharp as winter frost. Eleanor has already chosen her fate. She will serve as an example to others who might consider rebellion. The knife moved toward Eleanor's face, and Clara realized with sick certainty that Bellwether intended to disfigure the girl as an object lesson in the price of defiance. But before he could complete the motion, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. Horace. Everyone turned to see Jed Whitley standing in the main doorway, his clothes torn and bloody, but his bearing straight and proud for the first time in years. In his hands was a leather portfolio that Clara recognized as Bellwether's private records. Looking for these, Jed asked, holding up the documents. Your complete files on every girl you've bought and sold, every buyer you've dealt with, every official you've bribed. Everything the territorial marshal will need to put you away forever. Bellwether's face went white with rage and fear. You worthless drunk! You think anyone will believe the word of a failed preacher against a pillar of the community? They'll believe the evidence, Jed replied calmly. Names, dates, bank transfers, correspondence. You kept meticulous records, Horace. Your pride will be your downfall. Guards! Bellwether screamed. Kill him! Kill them all! But before his men could act, the hall's main doors burst open, and a dozen armed figures poured in. Clara's heart leaped as she recognized Ruth, leading a group of older girls' former residents who'd escaped over the years and returned for this final confrontation. Nobody move. Ruth's voice carried absolute authority as she and her companions took firing positions around the room. This ends tonight. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Bellwether still held Eleanor with a knife at her throat, but he was surrounded now, outnumbered and outgunned by people who'd survived his cruelties and come back for justice. You can't win, he said. But Clara could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. Even if you kill me, there are others. The network I've built will continue without me. Maybe, Clara replied, taking a careful step closer. But you won't be there to see it. Stay back. Bellwether pressed the knife deeper, drawing more blood from Eleanor's neck. I swear I'll... The gunshot came from an unexpected direction. Not from Clara or Toma or any of the former residents, but from Eleanor herself. The girl had somehow managed to get hold of a small pistol, probably one taken from a guard during the chaos, and had pressed it against Bellwether's ribs before pulling the trigger. Horace Bellwether, pillar of the community and destroyer of innocence, looked down at the spreading red stain on his white shirt with an expression of complete disbelief. He whispered. Ruth taught me, Eleanor said, stepping away from his loosening grip. She taught all of us. Said someday we might need to know how to kill monsters. Bellwether swayed on his feet, his pale eyes losing focus as blood loss weakened him. This isn't over. The buyers will find other sources, other suppliers. You've solved nothing. We've solved you, Clara said quietly. Horace Bellwether fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, and moved no more. The silence that followed Bellwether's death was profound, broken only by the quiet sobbing of girls who were finally beginning to believe that their nightmare was truly over. Clara stood in the center of the main hall, her rifle lowered but ready, watching as Ruth and the other former residents secured the remaining guards and buyers. Miriam Bellwether sat in a chair near the platform, her steel-gray hair disheveled and her thin face blank with shock. The woman who'd ruled through fear and biblical quotation seemed to have aged a decade in the space of minutes, her authority crumbling along with her brother's empire. What do we do with them? Sadie asked, gesturing toward the cluster of buyers who stood with their hands raised and their faces pale with fear. We let the law decide, Jed said, emerging from the shadows with the portfolio of evidence still clutched in his hands. Marshal Davidson should be here within the hour. I sent word before the attack began. Clara looked around at the scene of destruction and liberation, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. 18 girls freed from slavery, a trafficking network exposed and destroyed, justice served to monsters who'd hidden behind Christian rhetoric and social respectability. But the cost had been high. 2 of Ruth's group had been wounded in the fighting, and Eleanor bore fresh scars that would take time to heal. Most importantly, the 18 girls now standing free in the main hall faced an uncertain future in a world that had never cared much about their welfare. What happens to them now? Clara asked Ruth. That's up to them. The old woman replied, her weathered face showing satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. Some have families to return to, others will need new starts in new places. But they'll have choices now. Real choices. And the evidence, everything Bellwether didn't want the authorities to see. Jed said, patting the portfolio. Bank records, correspondence bills of sale going back 5 years, enough to implicate buyers and officials across 3 territories. Clara felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. For months, she'd lived with the constant pressure of being hunted of, knowing that powerful men wanted to own her body and soul. Now those men would face justice, and other girls would be spared the horrors of Raven's Crossing. Clara. Eleanor approached with her characteristic quiet dignity despite the bandage around her neck where Bellwether's knife had cut her. "There's something else you should know." "What?" Bellwether kept detailed records of every transaction, every sale, including information about girls who were bought years ago who might still be alive somewhere. Clara's pulse quickened. "How many?" "Hundreds. Names, locations, descriptions of buyers. If we can get this information to the right people, we can save them too." Sadie finished, understanding dawning in her voice. "It won't be easy," Ruth warned. "Some of those girls have been gone for years. They might not want to be found, might have built new lives for themselves." "Then we give them the choice," Clara said firmly. "We find them, we tell them they have options, and we let them decide for themselves." The sound of hoofbeats echoed from outside, and Clara tensed before recognizing the approach of official riders. Marshal Davidson appeared in the doorway moments later, his face grim with professional purpose as he took in the scene of destruction and liberation. "Miss Whitley," he said, tipping his hat respectfully. "I understand you have some evidence for me." Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "We have everything you need, Marshal. Everything and more." 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of the Freedom Valley Academy, watching the sun set over the New Mexico mountains as 23 young women finished their evening chores and prepared for study time. The building was new, constructed on land donated by the territorial government as restitution for the crimes committed at Raven's Crossing. The academy wasn't just a school, it was a sanctuary for survivors of trafficking operations throughout the Southwest. Some students had been rescued from situations similar to Bellwether's compound. Others were simply girls from poor families who needed education and opportunity. All of them learned that their lives belonged to them, that they had choices and rights, and the power to shape their own destinies. Hard to believe it's only been 6 months. Sadie said, emerging from the main building with a stack of papers that represented her students' latest poetry assignments. Her sister had found her calling as a teacher and counselor, helping other survivors find their voices through art and literature. "Feels like a lifetime." Clara agreed, watching Toma and Caleb working with a group of students to repair fencing around the vegetable garden. The Gray Elk brothers had stayed to help run the academy, their ranch serving as both a practical education site and a symbol that freedom could be built on honest work. The trials had been everything Clara had hoped for and more. The evidence from Bellwether's files had led to the conviction of 37 men on charges ranging from kidnapping to conspiracy. The network that had supported his operation was systematically dismantled, its members scattered to prison or exile. Miriam Bellwether had received 25 years in the territorial prison, her final words in court, a bitter denunciation of the unnatural rebellion that had destroyed her brother's work. She would die there 3 years later, still insisting that she'd been saving souls rather than destroying them. Of the 18 girls freed from Raven's Crossing, all had survived their transition to freedom, though not without struggle. Some had returned to families, others had chosen new lives in distant places, and a few had stayed to help run the academy. Eleanor had become Clara's assistant, her inside knowledge of trafficking operations, helping them identify and rescue other victims. Ruth had lived to see justice served before passing peacefully in her sleep, 2 months after the trials ended. Her funeral was attended by more than 100 people, survivors she'd helped, families she'd reunited, and officials who'd come to respect her wisdom and courage. But perhaps the most important change was in Jed Whitley himself. Clara's father had found a kind of redemption in his final months, using his knowledge of Bellwether's network to help authorities track down other operations. He testified at every trial, his detailed confession helping to convict men who might otherwise have escaped justice. He died on a Tuesday morning in spring, sitting on the porch of the academy and watching his daughters teach a group of young women how to read. His last words had been an apology, not for his crimes, which could never be forgiven, but for the years he'd wasted in guilt and self-pity instead of fighting for justice. Now Clara walked to the small cemetery behind the academy, where a simple wooden cross marked his grave. She'd never fully forgiven him, might never be able to. But she'd learned to understand that people could be more than their worst choices, that redemption was possible even for those who'd lost their way in darkness. "Thought I might find you here," Toma said, approaching with his characteristic quiet grace. Over the past months, something had grown between them. Not romance exactly, but a deep partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Just thinking," Clara replied, not moving from her position beside the grave. "About what?" "About second chances. About whether people can really change, really make amends for the things they've done." Toma was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Your father did more good in his last 6 months than most people do in a lifetime. That doesn't erase his crimes, but it counts for something. Does helping to free 100 girls balance out the dozens he helped enslave? I don't know," Toma admitted. "But I know that those 100 girls are free because he found the courage to fight back. That has to mean something." Clara thought about the students preparing for bed in the dormitories, young women who would wake tomorrow to lessons and laughter, to choices and opportunities, to the knowledge that their lives belonged to them. She thought about the dozens of other girls who'd been found and freed because of information from Bellwether's files, families reunited and futures reclaimed. "Maybe that's enough," she said finally. "Maybe it doesn't matter whether the scales balance perfectly. Maybe what matters is that they tip toward justice in the end." As they walked back toward the academy together, Clara caught sight of something that made her smile. In the window of the main dormitory, silhouetted against the lamplight, Eleanor sat with 3 of the younger students, reading to them from a book of poetry. Around them, 24 young women prepared for sleep, without fear, their dreams untroubled by the knowledge that powerful men saw them as property. "Spring's coming early this year," Toma observed, noting the green shoots beginning to emerge from the winter-hard ground. Clara smiled, remembering a conversation that felt like a lifetime ago. "What do you want to plant?" "Hope." Toma replied the same answer he'd given her when they were fugitives running for their lives. "Always hope." Clara looked back once more at the lights of the academy, at the visible proof that broken things could be made whole, that survivors could become healers, that the future could be brighter than the past. "The first seed is freedom," she said softly. "Everything else grows from that." But as they reached the academy steps, a figure emerged from the shadows that made Clara's hand instinctively move toward her pistol. It was a young woman, maybe 17, with hollow eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to expect violence. "Miss Whitley," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Sarah. Sarah Mackenzie. I heard you help girls like me." Clara felt her heart clench as she recognized the signs, the fresh bruises, the torn dress, the desperate hope mixed with resigned despair. Another survivor, another girl who'd fought her way to freedom and needed help believing it was real. "We do," Clara said gently, stepping forward with open hands. "We help girls exactly like you. I escaped from a place like the one in the newspapers. It took me 3 months to find you, and I wasn't sure." "You're sure now?" Clara interrupted, taking the girl's hands in hers. "You're safe now. Come inside, there's food, clean clothes, and people who understand what you've been through." As they led Sarah into the academy, Clara felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The work wasn't finished, might never be finished, as long as men thought they could own other human beings. But each girl they saved, each survivor they helped heal was a victory against the darkness. The letter came the next morning, delivered by territorial mail and bearing the seal of the governor's office. Clara read it twice before the words fully sank in. Miss Whitley, I write to inform you that the territorial government has approved your proposal for the expansion of the Freedom Valley Academy. In recognition of your service to the territory and your efforts to combat human trafficking, you are hereby granted ownership of the entire Ravens Crossing property to be converted into a permanent sanctuary for survivors of exploitation. Furthermore, the legislature has voted to establish the Whitley Foundation, a territorial agency dedicated to identifying and dismantling trafficking operations throughout the Southwest. You are offered the position of director with full authority to hire staff, allocate resources, and coordinate with federal law enforcement agencies. Your courage has inspired a new generation of advocates for justice. Please accept this modest recognition of your extraordinary service. Respectfully, yours, Governor William Hayes. Clara set the letter down with shaking hands, barely able to process the magnitude of what was being offered. Not just personal recognition, but the resources and authority to fight trafficking on a territorial scale. The chance to build something that could protect countless girls from the horrors she and Sadie had endured. Good news? Eleanor asked, reading over her shoulder. Life-changing news. Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. What do you think? Director Whitley has a nice ring to it. Clara looked around at the academy, at the students preparing for their morning lessons, at the tangible proof that freedom and healing were possible, even in the darkest circumstances. I think, she said finally, that some seeds grow into forests. That evening, as Clara stood once more on the academy porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 19 years old and sold like livestock, hunted through the desert by men who saw her as property, standing now as the director of an organization dedicated to ensuring that no other girl would suffer as she had. The transformation seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale rather than the harsh reality of the frontier. But it had happened through the choices of ordinary people who decided that justice was worth fighting for, that human dignity was worth preserving, that freedom was worth the risk of everything. In her pocket, she carried 2 mementos of that journey. The first was a piece of her mother's blue dress, faded with age, but still carrying the faint scent of lavender and love. The second was her father's final letter, his attempt to explain choices that could never be fully understood or forgiven. Both reminded her that people were complex, that heroism and villainy often existed in the same heart, that redemption was possible, even for those who'd lost their way in darkness. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara May Whitley, survivor teacher and now director of the territorial fight against human trafficking, felt the weight of her responsibilities and the lightness of her freedom in perfect balance. Behind her, the Freedom Valley Academy hummed with the quiet sounds of young women preparing for sleep without fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new survivors who needed help, new battles against those who profited from human misery. But tonight, 24 girls would sleep safely their dreams, untroubled by the knowledge that they belonged to themselves and no one else. The academy stood as more than just a building. It was a promise that chains could be broken, that cages could become sanctuaries, that the future could be built on foundations of justice rather than exploitation. Each student who learned to read, each survivor who found her voice, each young woman who discovered her own worth was a victory against the darkness that had once seemed absolute. Clara fingered the piece of her mother's dress in her pocket, remembering the woman who taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She thought of her father, whose path to redemption had been paid for with blood and guilt, but had ultimately led to the freedom of hundreds of girls. She remembered Eleanor's courage, Ruth's wisdom, the Gray Elk brothers' fierce loyalty to justice. All of them had planted seeds in ground that seemed too hard for anything good to grow. But freedom, Clara had learned, was the most resilient crop of all. Given even the smallest chance, it would take root and flourish, spreading until it covered the earth with its protective shade. Toma emerged from the academy and stood beside her, his presence a comfort that no longer surprised her. They'd been married quietly the month before, bound together not by ownership or obligation, but by choice and mutual respect, the kind of partnership that honored both their individual strength and their shared purpose. Busy day tomorrow, he observed, nodding toward the correspondence that had arrived with the governor's letter. 3 more rescue operations to coordinate 2 trials to testify at, and a new group of students arriving from Colorado. The work never ends. Clara agreed, but her voice held satisfaction rather than complaint. Would you want it to? Clara considered the question, thinking of all the girls still trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped, all the families still vulnerable to predators like Bellwether, all the work that remained to be done. No, she said finally. This is what we're meant to do. This is what makes everything we went through worthwhile. A shooting star streaked across the desert sky, brilliant and brief against the eternal darkness. Clara made no wish. She'd learned that freedom wasn't something you wished for, but something you took, something you built, something you protected with everything you had. The first seed had been planted in the ashes of Raven's Crossing Christian Home. Now it was growing into something larger than any one person or place, a movement, a promise of future where no child would be bought or sold, where every person understood their inherent worth and dignity. Clara May Whitley, the preacher's daughter who'd been sold for whiskey and debt, stood on her porch in the desert night and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, new opportunities, to prove that justice was stronger than greed, that love was more powerful than hate, that freedom once planted would always find a way to grow. The seeds of liberty had taken root in the hardest ground imaginable. Now all that remained was to tend the garden and watch it flourish.